I know it's been a while, but today we're back with PUBG Solo Beginner Tips Part 2. In the first Solo Beginner Tips video, we covered drop locations, parachuting, weapon classes, and inventory management. So if you guys haven't seen that video, check the YouTube card in the top right corner now. For today's video, we're going to be focusing on strategy, and particularly we're going to break it down into two sections, firstly being circle management and how to strategize your way around the zone in PUBG, and secondly we'll look at combat strategy and different tactics that you can apply in a 1v1 combat situation. So first things first, getting started, learning about the circle in PUBG. The zone closes in different phases. For phase 1 and 2, you don't really take much damage at all being outside in the blue zone, so you shouldn't be afraid of it. Learn to prioritize looting up well, and utilize your boosters, being energy drinks, painkillers, and adrenaline syringes, which will pretty much allow you to maintain your health outside the blue during these early phases. That way, once you do enter the safe zone, you're well equipped and ready for battle. As a beginner player in PUBG, I would recommend trying not to be outside in the blue zone after phase 3 circle closes. From this point onwards, you will notice that your health does go down pretty quickly, and as an experienced player, you can probably manage to be outside in the blue zone and still fight opponents pretty effectively, but it is easy to be caught off guard and to end up dying in the blue zone if you're not careful. Keep in mind that the further away from the new safe zone that you are when that zone closes, the more that your health is going to chunk. So it's a good idea to take note of nearby vehicles or get moving early to avoid being stuck in the blue. On the flip side, once you do enter the safe zone in the early phases, you can be pretty confident that there are going to be other players running in from the blue zone. So make sure that you don't treat that as a safe area, but rather keep a keen eye out for players still in the blue. During later phases, say phase 3 and phase 4, as the game goes on, you can be more and more confident that there are no longer players outside in the blue. Another thing to take into account regarding the blue zone in PUBG is that the center of the zone will never land directly over water. You can use this to your advantage later in the game to predict where the next zone is going to close. For example, in this situation, where the zone covers both the north and the south island on Erangel, you can tell because there is more of the zone in play on the north island, that the next zone is going to close over the north island. And another example here on Sanhok, you can see that the center of the zone would be around about here, meaning that you can predict that the next zone is going to close over the North Island, even though there are 3 separate areas that are effectively still in the zone. Okay, moving on. If you've watched any of my previous tips videos for PUBG, you probably have heard me talk about the wedge. The wedge is a classic must-know tip for new players in PUBG. When we talk about the circle or zone movement and mechanics in PUBG, it's important to remember that the zone movement is relative to the new zone, meaning that the edges of the zone closer to the new zone will move much slower, and the edges further away from the new zone are going to close pretty quickly. So why is this important to know? Well, if you're sitting on the wedge, remember this is the area that closes very slowly. It means that players are going to be more focused on fighting other players than trying to push to the new zone, because the movement of the zone is pretty much irrelevant in this position. For that reason, you'll find that the wedge is a pretty populated spot in PUBG, and the more wedgy the zone is, the more likely it is that there's going to be a lot of players. For this reason as well, you'll find that a lot of the more experienced players will try and position themselves in the wedge. So as a new player in PUBG, you want to use this to your advantage, and understand that you probably want to try and avoid sitting directly in this location. That is, until you get a bit more confident and experienced, and willing to fight consecutive players. On the flip side again, if you're on the fat side of the zone that closes pretty quickly, you want to be thinking ahead in regards to, do you have a vehicle nearby that will allow you to get into zone quickly, or do you need to tighten up the boots and start running straight away? Having this information under your belt is a very handy way to get kills as a beginner player in PUBG. For example, if you position yourself inside the safe zone, close to the fat side of the zone, then you're bound to catch players running into the safe zone who are more focused with running than looking for people to shoot at. Also, because these players are bound to be caught outside of the zone, they're already going to be damaged and won't take as many hits to kill. And if you want to be extra sneaky, wait until these players get into the safe zone, because more often than not they're going to instantly start medding up and they're pretty much sitting ducks ready to be killed. I personally hate it when I die like this, so I'm not really sure why I'm giving you this tip. So in a nutshell, always consider where you're positioned in relation to the wedge. Try and prioritize getting into the safe zone rather than fighting opponents, especially during the later phases, and use your understanding of the zone to your advantage to catch players when they're weak and off guard. Okay, moving on to the second part of this tip video, where we talk about combat strategy. And you may find that this video does overlap a little bit with my third tips video, where we're going to talk about gunplay and combat, but hopefully the videos will complement each other nicely. So for this section, we're going to talk about tips regarding a 1v1 battle in third person perspective, because that's what I primarily play. The first and most important thing to consider regarding combat strategy in PUBG is to think about what your opponent can see. Remember that in third person perspective mode, players can see a lot more than they can see in first person perspective. So you want to use this knowledge to your advantage and avoid running down long hallways or corridors or open spaces in front of building windows, where players could be watching you without revealing themselves. You can also use this knowledge to your advantage by thinking about where players are likely to be watching you from, and using throwables such as molotovs or frags to flush them out from that position. The next thing to consider is to always be on the move. Don't sit in one spot for too long, because this pretty much facilitates your enemy making an attack plan against you. And the more experienced players will utilize well-placed throwables to kill you or move you out from your position. Personally, I don't really sit in one spot for more than 5 or 10 seconds. Unless I literally have nowhere else to move to, I'll stay on the move to make myself unpredictable. If you do decide that you want to camp in one position, then quite simply, do not move. Any movement, even turning your character on the spot, is easily heard by the keen ears of experienced players, and before you know it, you'll be sent back to the loading screen. Although camping can be a way to get some easy kills in PUBG, I wouldn't necessarily recommend doing this too often, because it is going to limit your progression as a player in PUBG, and it makes you heavily rely on your environment and having a good place to camp in the zone for it to be effective. As I touched on earlier, it's always really important to be as unpredictable as possible in PUBG. For example, if you're flanking your enemy and you cross some terrain where you think that your opponent may have seen you, then once you move out of their line of sight, reroute and move back the other direction. Always try and keep your enemy on their toes and guessing where you may be. Not only is this a good strategic move, but it also puts your opponent on edge, and when you're stressed, you don't think too clearly. Also consider pushing your opponent unexpectedly or running away, repositioning, and resetting your strategy or game plan. Don't feel like every player you come up against you have to fight. Personally, I often push away from gunfights when I feel like I'm out of position or at a disadvantage. And as a beginner player in PUBG, you might be asking, what sort of things put me at an advantage or disadvantage in a 1v1 fight? And there's a few things that I would be considering. First of all, it's where are you positioned in regards to your enemy and the safe zone. For example, if you're closer to the safe zone than your enemy, you may want to consider repositioning inside the safe zone and using the blue zone to your advantage. You also want to consider your weapon setup and how many meds you have. For example, if you have a good close range weapon like a Vector or a shotgun, then maybe pushing your enemy is a good option. Whereas if you're running 2 bolt action rifles, then I would be getting the hell out of there and pushing further away from your opponent. And if you have lots of medical supplies, maybe you can spend a bit more time outside in the blue zone fighting your enemy. But again, as a beginner player in PUBG, I wouldn't necessarily recommend this because you're probably still getting used to the intricacies of a 1v1 fight, and adding the additional disadvantage of bleeding to the zone is not handy in this situation. And probably the other main thing to consider is what your strengths are in this game. Would you consider yourself more of a shooter or more of a strategizer? Because this would also dictate what to do in these situations. And finally, probably the most important tip to take from today's video is to remember that this game isn't easy. People have been playing since day one, so you're going to die over and over. It's really important not to compare yourself to experienced players or even to some streamers. take it easy on yourself, have a good time, and learn from your mistakes. At the end of the day, that's the best way to improve in PUBG, and is really a good way to approach things other than just video games. But anyway, there's some tips for what I know about strategy in PUBG. Keep an eye out for episode 3 of my PUBG Beginner Tips series, where we're going to talk about gunplay and combat. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing for similar videos in the future, and come say hi when I go live on Twitch. I'm always happy to answer your questions. But anyway guys, take it easy, and I'll see you soon.